the Champion Showdown 9LX tournament came to a dramatic conclusion. Going into the 9th and final round, 2 players shared the lead. Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura, the 2 online rapid specialists. Carlsen was playing Aronian, Nakamura faced Svidler, and that's the game we're going to concentrate on, but I'll bring you up to date with what happened within the Carlsen game as well. So Nakamura with the white pieces. Let's just have a quick look at the baseline. Remember, it's Fischer random chess, and the players are shown this particular setup just a few minutes before the game starts, so no chance for any serious preparation. But this one isn't so random. You can see the bishops are on their traditional starting squares, and that rook, well, it's not in the corner, but it's in the middle, which is useful, and the queen is on its traditional starting square as well. So that means that white can play the pawn to e4, and it's supported by the rook and looks very sturdy. And now Svidler unbalanced the position with d5. So it's a strange kind of Scandi. But the difference is, of course, if that's taken, then queen takes, and there's no knight that can come to c3. But Nakamura pushed on, and this looks very reasonable, particularly when the pawn is supported by the rook, just gaining space. And after bishop f5, this looks really like a Caro-Kann advance variation. So that bishop comes out before the pawn shuts it in with e6. But bishop f5 looks a bit dubious to me, because white gains time against the bishop, brings a knight out, and now gains space by threatening to advance again to trap the bishop. Pawn to h5, d4 and e6, and bishop d3, well, and exchanges off this dangerous bishop. And white even threatens already to play queen h7, trapping the knight in the corner. Quite extraordinary. To my mind, white is already better here, or let's just say has a very pleasant position. It's a very familiar kind of position, with these pawns clamping black's pawns on this side of the board. You might recall a game from the candidates earlier in the year between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Jan Nepomniachtchi, where MVL also had these pawns and won a beautiful game. Well, in fact, it was this kind of structure. And here Nakamura exchanged on f6. And I was really surprised about that, because I think it's a good idea to maintain that pawn on e5. For example, playing this move. And then white could play in the way that MVL played, f4, and later on g4. And that's a really nice break when there's a pawn on h5. Or alternatively, put the knight on f4. It's also very strong. But Hikaru exchanged on f6, and that, of course, liberates black's pieces to some extent. Although, I mean, white has a very regular setup here. There's nothing wrong with white's position at all. But it just feels as though black is suddenly back in the game once that pawn has disappeared from e5. And here, well, it looked to me as though Nakamura was in a big hurry with his next move. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with, for example, playing bishop d2, or maybe a3 and king a2, and then developing. But knight h2, I mean, it just looks funny to move this knight again when the position's kind of opened a bit. If queen takes, then rook f1, and actually white gets pretty decent play there. I think rightly Svidler declined to take on f2, and instead he castled at the other end of the board. The king and rook are going to end up there. Let's just have a quick look. There we go. king on c8, rook on d8. So he's connected his rooks. The king is pretty safe. And suddenly White's position looks a bit odd. You know, Nakamura hasn't sorted his king out yet. He's fiddling around with this knight. He played knight g4, but then queen h4, and this queen is actually very annoying. Attacks the knight on g4. You know, looks at the h-pawn, although it's protected at the moment, but it might be hit very soon with a knight f6. Nakamura now played knight e5. So this was exchanged off. I mean, I just found this a really surprising way of playing. Yes, he's got the pawn back on e5, but black is able to take reasonable control here, and that queen is actually really annoying for white. Knight e7, good move. Knight has to come into play. Bishop d2, so that might be preparing castling, or it might just be bringing the bishop into the game. Knight c6, good move. And now if white were to castle, so the king would go on c1 and the rook on d1, then the funny thing is that queen could potentially swoop across the board to attack the pawn on a2. It's an interesting idea. And that's why I think f4 was played by Nakamura. Bishop c5, good move, and that controls some really nice squares on this diagonal. And this is a tricky one already. You know, you might want to play rook h1, but then queen g4, and that's absolutely fine. I mean, the queen is sitting very nicely on g4 there. Can't be won at all. So, rook f1 played by Nakamura. Queen h2, so this is daring play by Svidler. You know, he's sending his queen deep into the heart of enemy territory, but it's very strong. So the queen simply threatens to take that pawn. If, say, queen f3, then you can hassle the queen again with knight d4. At this stage, Nakamura had just 8 minutes remaining. Svidler had 10.5 minutes, so Svidler was even a little bit ahead on the clock. a3 by Nakamura. This is just a pragmatic move. He dumps the g-pawn and just puts his king on a safe square instead of castling. I mean, the king is much safer on a2, of course. So, is there going to be a problem with the queen? Well, the bishop controls these squares, so it doesn't look like there's a problem. But at least by playing this, Nakamura has kind of secured his position to some extent. And it's difficult for black to attack these pawns. But this is an excellent move by Svidler. Bishop f2 hits the knight, which came back to h1, and the bishop went all the way back to b6. So it's now on a more secure square than c5. That's fine. And what can white do in the meantime? Not a lot, actually. And this queen might even find its way to e4. Rook f3 played. Okay, potentially the rook can come to g3, and that's what happened. Knight d4 hits the rook. Rook g3, attacking the queen, so queen e4. That's a nice move. Beautiful centralization. If this is exchanged, then that pawn on e4 is potentially very dangerous. The rook is looking at that unprotected bishop on d2. The knight might swing into f5 or indeed take that pawn on c2. It's just a tremendous position for black. So after queen e4, knight f2 from Nakamura. Clock time's evening up. 5 minutes 48 for Nakamura, 6:45 for Svidler. Well, black is a pawn up, so why not exchange queens? And here, this is a big moment in the game, actually. Black has two very attractive continuations. Do you play knight takes pawn and allow rook takes, but, well, there could be advantages to doing that? Or do you play the knight back to f5 to hold the pawn and put the knight on a very nice square? Well, it might have been better to get a bit messy like this. Allow rook g7. But in this position, the rook can always come across to exchange off here. And later on, well, we could have two pawns rolling down the board. Maybe that was the best way to go. Knight f5 also wasn't bad. I mean, that's certainly the safest way of play. But that rook is a bit annoying. And now Nakamura found an excellent idea. Basically, that knight holds black's position together. It prevents counterplay because it defends the pawn on g7. So what do? Well, you need to exchange off that knight. So that knight started a journey. Basically, it went to f2 and then to g3. Let's see. Knight f2. Takes a little bit of time, but is the only way for white to find counterplay. c4. Okay, the pawns are rolling. The bishop hits the knight, which went back to h1. Didn't take that long, did it? We're almost there. Rook d7. Now, clearly Nakamura was concerned about knight g3, knight h4, and that knight bouncing in here. So that's why he played rook f1 first to cover that square. Rook f7, supporting the knight. Knight g3. Now, clock times. Well, Nakamura was playing incredibly quickly, and he'd actually gained time because were playing on an increment. I think they were getting 30 seconds per move. So clock time 6:25 for Nakamura, 3:45 for Svidler. Svidler obviously feeling a little bit unsure how to try to press home his pawn advantage. So he took on g3 and brought the king up. That looks very reasonable. But now that rook, having exchanged off the knight, that rook has to guard the pawn on g7. And that pawn on f4 is well protected. Bishop b4. Well, it's still protected by the rook on f1, but the bishop looking maybe to come in here. But actually, after a5, Nakamura thought better of it. I mean, it's possible that wasn't such a great move, actually. But Nakamura was kind of had the bit between his teeth now. He was moving quickly, and he was playing on Svidler's time a little bit. And you could see that Svidler was just looking a little bit uncomfortable. But yeah, it doesn't look so great because after this, in fact, Nakamura had to just bring the bishop back. If the bishop had gone in, then bishop c7 exchanges off the bishop and, well, it looks like black is making progress. So bishop d2, d4, those pawns rolling, c3, Nakamura has to stop those. And now, probably a4 is a good move to really just clamp that square here. I mean, if this is taken, then that kind of straightens everything out. The pawn can come to b5 to protect things. I mean, I don't think white should exchange off, but white needs to do something because that king threatens to march into a beautiful square here. a4 looks like the move. Instead, Svidler played king c6, looking to come in here. It looks very reasonable, but watch what happened. Pawn takes pawn. Nakamura seized his chance. Rook c1, clock times, 5:17 Nakamura, 2:37 for Svidler. Rook attacks the pawn. And after b5, a4 breaks up those pawns. So just in time before black can play a4. Compare this with the other variation we had earlier. Now it's getting tricky. Maybe rook d8 is the best move here, but rook b8 played, and after pawn takes pawn, well, king takes pawn still leaves black with pawn advantage and, well, some chances, although I think once these pawns are split, it's actually very, very difficult. But instead, rook takes b5. Rook takes pawn check, king d5. So Nakamura's got his pawn back. And here I suspect that Svidler had simply overlooked that white could play b3 to take the pressure off that b pawn. And now, well, there's even a threat to play rook d3 to pin and win that bishop. But this is very strange. After b3, Nakamura offered a draw, which Svidler accepted. Now, it should be a draw because black can actually liquidate after rook c5. And after, well, for example, this, we're just simplifying down to a drawn rook and pawn endgame. And so on. It's going to be a mass liquidation of pawns. So it should be a draw after b3, but it took everyone by surprise, you know, because there still seems to be some play in the position. Nakamura's just got the pawn back, but it should be a draw. Yeah, Svidler didn't make the most of his advantage in this game. Disappointing from him, but I think Hikaru, his opening was well, round about when he played the pawn to e5 and h5 looked very good, but yeah, Svidler definitely had the advantage. So that meant that if Carlsen could defeat Aronian, then Carlsen would win the tournament outright. We reach a position after 41 moves, way down in the game. Carlsen with the white pieces. Aronian has just played his knight to c6. You can see it's even pawns. Carlsen had been squeezing in this game. And it looks like things are going his way. If he takes here and plays g6, those pawns are really dangerous. Bishop here, knight g3, and then, well, for example, knight takes pawn, knight h5, and that is a big pawn to win. One of those is going to go through. Looks like it's winning. Or knight e7, you protect the pawn first, and then go in here, or maybe bring the king up the board. It looks really good for white. But instead of knight takes knight, Carlsen played g6. Now, this was a finesse. He wanted to throw this one in first, so the bishop did not have the d5 square available because it's still covered by that knight on e7. But he simply forgot that after knight takes knight, that this bishop was protected. So after this, he found himself a pawn down. What a turnaround. Aronian under so much pressure. And now he's a pawn up. So basically, Carlsen had to scramble for a draw, but he just liquidated pawns. And, well, they played on a few more moves, but actually, this is pretty easy to draw with so few pawns on the board. And, yeah, easy draw for Carlsen. But a disappointment. So that meant that both Nakamura and Carlsen had the same score. They were tied at the top of the tournament, so they were the joint winners of the tournament. No Armageddon today. It was a really interesting tournament. Of course, we had Garry Kasparov playing as well, and yeah, it was very interesting. I have to say, I do enjoy Fischer Random now and again. It's certainly an interesting variant. So, thanks very much for watching. There'll be more coming later in the week. See you then.